I'm Grace, 32 female. I work as an archivist for the city, spending my days surrounded by the quiet, orderly ghosts of the past, meticulously preserving letters and records. My life, until recently, felt just as orderly, especially since moving in with my fiancé, Alex, a high school history teacher who shares my love for stories hidden in time. We were planning our wedding, a small, beautiful ceremony that was supposed to be the happiest day of our lives, but my family's disapproval cast a long, cold shadow over everything. They made it clear they wouldn't be there, and their final, cruel gesture was meant to break me. Instead, it revealed a secret that would unravel their entire world. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. The story of my family's disapproval of Alex began, as many of these things do, with money and status. My father, Arthur, was a retired investment banker who viewed the world as a series of transactions and balance sheets. My mother, Alina, curated her social standing as meticulously as I curated historical documents, chairing charity boards and hosting dinners where the guest list was more important than the meal. In their world, success was measured in stock portfolios and prestigious job titles. My younger brother, Julian, fit their mold perfectly. At 30, he was already a junior partner at a top corporate law firm, drove a German luxury car, and dated women who looked like they'd stepped out of a magazine. He was their masterpiece, their proof of superior parenting. I, on the other hand, had always been a quiet disappointment. My passion for history, which led me to become an archivist, was deemed a quaint hobby rather than a serious career. "There's no money in dust, Grace," my father would say with a dismissive wave of his hand. They tolerated my choices, but they never celebrated them. When I introduced them to Alex, I had a naive hope that they would see what I saw, a kind, intelligent, and passionate man who made me happier than I'd ever been. They saw something else entirely. They saw a public school teacher with a modest salary, a 10-year-old sedan, and a genuine lack of interest in climbing any corporate ladder. "A teacher," my mother had said, her voice laced with a delicate horror, as if I'd announced he was a professional gambler. "But Grace, what will people think?" The conversation went downhill from there. My father grilled Alex about his long-term financial prospects, while my mother asked pointed questions about his family, who were good, hardworking people without a single banker or society figure among them. Alex handled it with a grace I could only admire, answering their questions calmly and without apology. But the verdict was in. He wasn't good enough. He wasn't Julian. The tension simmered for months. Every family dinner became a minefield of backhanded compliments and passive-aggressive remarks aimed at Alex. "It must be so rewarding to have your summers off," my mother would say, implying he was lazy. "I suppose job security is a comfort when ambition is lacking," my father would add. Julian, ever the loyal son, would just smirk, enjoying the spectacle of Alex being slowly dissected. When Alex proposed, the joy was immediately tempered by the dread of telling my parents. We went to their house for dinner, the engagement ring feeling like a lead weight on my finger. I announced our news, and the room fell into a thick, suffocating silence. My mother's smile was thin and brittle. "Well," she said finally, "that's a decision." My father simply looked at Alex and said, "I hope you know what you're getting into." There were no congratulations, no hugs, no excitement. It was an acceptance of a regrettable outcome. The first major battle was over the wedding invitations. We had designed them ourselves, with the help of my best friend Maya. They were simple and elegant, reflecting the small, intimate ceremony we wanted at a local botanical garden. When I gave one to my parents, my mother held it between her thumb and forefinger as if it were contaminated. "A botanical garden?" she sniffed. "Not the country club." I explained that we wanted something that felt like us. "It feels cheap, Grace," my father stated flatly. A week later, my mother called. "Grace, your father and I have been talking," she began, her tone funereal. "We've been thinking about this wedding, and we just can't, in good conscience, support it." My heart dropped. "Support it? What does that mean?" "It means we won't be attending," she said, her voice cold and final. We cannot stand up and celebrate a union we believe is a mistake. You are throwing your life away on a man with no future, and we refuse to applaud it. It would be dishonest." I was stunned into silence. I could hear my father's voice in background coaching her. "But you're my parents," I whispered, the words feeling pathetic and small. "Exactly," she replied. "And as your parents, it is our duty to be honest with you, even if it's painful. When you come to your senses, we'll be here for you, but we will not be at that wedding." The line went dead. I stood in my kitchen, the phone still pressed to my ear, the silence ringing louder than her words. Alex found me minutes later, tears streaming down my face, and held me without saying a word. In that moment, I both hated my parents and desperately craved their approval, a toxic cocktail of emotions that churned in my stomach for weeks. Julian, of course, sided with them. "I have to respect their principles on this, Grace," he'd said with infuriating condescension. "They just want what's best for you." His absence was just another twist of the knife. I felt utterly orphaned, cast out for the crime of loving the wrong person. Despite the heartbreak, Alex and I decided to go ahead. Our wedding would be a celebration of our love, surrounded by the people who truly supported us, our friends, Alex's wonderful family, and my one bastion of sanity, my Aunt Isabel. The 2 weeks leading up to the wedding were a blur of defiance and sorrow. Every happy moment, from the final dress fitting to finalizing the menu, was tinged with the bitterness of my family's rejection. Maya was a rock, taking over my mother's duties without a single complaint, while Alex's parents welcomed me with an uncomplicated warmth that made my own parents' coldness even more painful. I tried to focus on the joy, on the life Alex and I were building, but at night the anger and hurt would creep in. How could they be so cruel? How could they choose their pride over their daughter's happiness? The wedding day arrived, bright and unseasonably warm for October. The botanical garden was stunning, a riot of autumn colors. As I put on my dress, with Maya and Alex's sister fussing over me, I felt a strange sense of peace settle in. This was my new family. The people in this garden were the ones who mattered. The ceremony was perfect. When I saw Alex waiting for me at the end of the aisle, his eyes shining, the knot of anxiety in my chest finally dissolved. I said my vows with a clear voice, my hand steady in his. My family wasn't there, and for those 20 minutes I didn't care. The reception was held in a beautiful greenhouse on the property, filled with fairy lights and laughter. Aunt Isabel gave a toast that was both hilarious and deeply moving, speaking of love's courage. Alex's father welcomed me to the family with a bear hug that left me breathless. We danced, we ate, we celebrated. It was only when we were back in our hotel room late that night, exhausted and happy, that the outside world intruded. Lying on the table by the door, amidst the small pile of gifts and cards from friends, was a single, expensive-looking envelope. It was thick, cream-colored cardstock, the kind my mother favored, with our hotel's name elegantly printed on the front. It hadn't been mailed, it had been delivered by a courier. My name was written on the front in my mother's perfect, looping script. A cold dread washed over me. "What is it?" Alex asked, coming over to put his arm around my shoulder. "I think." "It's from my parents," I said, my voice barely a whisper. My hands trembled as I picked it up. It felt heavy, not just with paper, but with expectation. I slid my finger under the seal and pulled out a greeting card. On the front was a generic, embossed design of 2 champagne glasses. There was no congratulations, no on your wedding day. Just the sterile image. I opened it. Inside, my mother's handwriting filled the right side of the card. It wasn't a letter, it was a lecture. "Grace," it began, "while we could not be present to witness your regrettable decision, we do hope that you will one day understand our position was taken out of love and concern for your future. We have always wanted the best for you, and it pains us to see you settle for so much less. We will always be your parents, and our door is open when you realize the gravity of your mistake." Every word was a carefully crafted barb designed to poison the happiest day of my life. It was cruel, condescending, and utterly unforgiving. My vision blurred with rage. "What does it say?" Alex asked gently, seeing my expression. I couldn't speak. I just handed him the card. He read it, and his face hardened. "Grace, I'm so sorry," he murmured, pulling me into a hug. "They're unbelievable." But that wasn't all. Tucked into the left side of the card was a check. I pulled it out, my breath catching in my throat. It was a personal check, drawn from my parents' joint account, but it wasn't made out to me. The pay to the order of line was written in my father's sharp, aggressive handwriting, Julian. The amount was for $10,000. For a moment, I was just confused. Why? Would they put a check for my brother and my wedding card? Then I saw the memo line at the bottom. 6 words that felt like a physical blow. For his future, more suitable wedding. The implication was brutally clear. This wasn't just a refusal to support my marriage, it was a financial endorsement of my brother's theoretical, superior one. They were taking the money they might have given me and pointedly, performatively, giving it to their perfect son. It was the ultimate vote of no confidence. It was a declaration that my life, my love, my choice was worthless. Something inside me snapped. The carefully constructed piece of the day shattered into a million pieces. A raw, guttural sob escaped my lips, a sound of pure anguish and fury. "I hate them," I choked out, the words tasting like acid. "I truly, truly hate them." Alex held me tighter, trying to soothe me, but the rage was a wildfire. I pulled away from him, the card and the check clutched in my hand. "This is what they think of me," I said, my voice shaking. "This is all I am to them, a bad investment." Without thinking, I tore the card in half, the thick stalk resisting before giving way with a satisfying rip. Then I took the check, the symbol of their gilded insult, and tore it into quarters, the pieces fluttering from my trembling fingers onto the plush hotel carpet. It was a visceral, impulsive act of defiance. I wanted to destroy it, to erase their toxic message from existence. I sank onto the floor, the rage dissolving into a familiar, hollow ache of grief for the parents I wished I had. Alex knelt beside me, quietly gathering the scattered paper fragments. "We'll throw them away," he said softly. "We'll forget this ever happened and just remember the beautiful parts of today." I nodded, burying my face in his shoulder, wanting to believe him. But as he collected the pieces, my archivist's eye, trained to notice details others miss, caught something. On the back of one of the torn check fragments, almost invisible against the patterned security background, was a faint, ghostly impression of writing that wasn't my father's. "Wait," I said, my voice hoarse. I pulled away from Alex and reached for the piece he was holding. It was the top right corner of the check, the section that would have been directly above the signature line. "Don't throw them out yet. Let me see them." Alex looked at me, confused, but handed over the small pile of torn paper. I spread the 8 fragments out on the dark wood of the coffee table, my wedding dress pooling around me on the floor. My hands were still shaking, but a different feeling was starting to push through the grief and anger, curiosity. It was the familiar thrum of a puzzle waiting to be solved, the core instinct of my profession. I carefully began to piece the check back together, lining up the torn edges like a miniature, heartbreaking jigsaw puzzle. The front was exactly as I remembered. Pay to the order of Julian, the amount, and my father's hateful memo. The signature line at the bottom was my father's, a sharp, arrogant scrawl. But it was the back that held my attention. When you write on a check from a checkbook, the pressure of the pen can leave an indentation on the carbonless copy paper of the check below it. But sometimes, if the paper is thin or the writer presses hard enough, it can leave an impression on the back of the check itself. The fragments I was looking at were from the middle of their checkbook, not the top copy. What I was seeing was a faint, ghostly imprint of writing from the check that had been written before mine. "What is it, Grace?" Alex asked, kneeling beside me, his brow furrowed with concern. "I don't know," I mumbled, my eyes scanning the pieces. "It's writing, an impression from another check." I arranged the pieces until the back of the check was whole again. The indentations were faint, barely legible. I tilted the pieces under the lamplight, trying to catch the shadows in the grooves of the paper. "Can you get me a pencil?" I asked. Alex, without questioning, went to his briefcase and brought me a graphite pencil. I took one of the larger fragments and, holding the pencil almost flat, gently shaded over the area where the writing was. It was a simple trick used to read indented writing, called an electrostatic detection apparatus in forensics, but known as rubbing to kids and archivists. As the gray graphite filled the paper, the ghostly white letters began to emerge, stark against the shading. My breath caught. I could make out words. Final distribution, account, and a series of numbers. I quickly did the same to the other pieces. As the full message appeared, a story began to form, written in the invisible ink of a previous transaction. It was a check made out to a law firm, Parker, Steele, and Vance, for a small amount, just a few $100s. The memo line was what made my heart pound: annual fee grandfather's trust. But it was the signature TH. It made the world tilt on its axis. Beneath my father's name on the signature line of that previous check, there was a second, fainter signature. It was a name I recognized instantly, a looping, elegant script I had seen on birthday cards and old letters my entire life. Isabel Thorne, my aunt. Why would my Aunt Isabel be a co-signer on a check related to my grandfather's trust? She was my mother's sister, but my grandfather, my father's father, had passed away more than a decade ago. I knew he had left my father a significant inheritance, but I had always been told it was a simple transfer of assets. A trust was never mentioned, and certainly not one that involved my aunt. My family was built on secrets and unspoken rules, but this felt different. This felt like a deliberate, carefully constructed lie. My father and Aunt Isabel were not close. In fact, they barely tolerated each other. He considered her an irresponsible artist, and she thought he was a pompous windbag. The idea of them sharing financial authority over anything, let alone my grandfather's legacy, was ludicrous. A cold realization began to dawn on me. My parents' insult, their meticulously planned act of cruelty, had been executed with a tool, a checkbook, that held a secret of its own. In their haste to hurt me, they had become sloppy. They had used a check from an account that was clearly not just their simple, joint checking account. This was something else. This was the key to a door I never even knew existed. "Alex," I said, my voice trembling with something new, something that wasn't anger or sadness. It was the thrill of discovery. My grandfather had a trust. My father and my aunt are both on the account. They lied to me. They lied about everything. Alex looked at the pencil rubbings, his history teacher's mind immediately grasping the implications of the primary source material I had just uncovered. "A trust controlled by two people who despise each other," he said, thinking aloud. "There has to be a reason for that. Your grandfather must have set it up that way deliberately." My mind was racing, connecting disparate memories. My grandfather, a stern but fair man, often lamenting my father's obsession with money. His fondness for Aunt Isabel's free spirit. His private conversations with me about the importance of integrity, conversations that always seemed to carry a weight I didn't understand at the time. "He didn't trust him," I whispered, the truth of it hitting me with the force of a physical blow. My grandfather didn't trust my father with his own inheritance. He put my aunt on the account as a check and balance. The cruelty of the check intended for Julian suddenly seemed so much smaller, a petty act in a much larger drama. My parents had spent my entire life making me feel inadequate, judging my choices and my character. All the while, they were living off a legacy managed under a structure that proved my grandfather had harbored the very same judgments about my father. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. I looked at the torn pieces of paper on the table. A few minutes ago, they were a symbol of my rejection. Now, they were a map. "They made a mistake," I said to Alex, a slow, determined smile spreading across my face. "They got careless, and I'm going to find out why." The rage was still there, but it was no longer a wild, destructive fire. It was focused, cold, and sharp. It was fuel. My wedding night had been hijacked by my parents' spite, but they had accidentally given me the greatest gift of all, the truth. And as an archivist, I knew exactly what to do with it. I was going to follow the paper trail. The next morning, the haze of wedding bliss was replaced by a sharp, clear sense of purpose. While Alex handled checking out of the hotel, I carefully placed the torn check fragments and the pencil rubbings into a protective archival sleeve I had in my purse. This was now evidence. My first call was to Aunt Isabel. I found her number and stepped out onto the hotel balcony, the cool morning air a welcome balm. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm and cheerful. "Grace. Honey, I was just thinking about you. What a beautiful wedding. You and Alex were just glowing." "It was perfect, Izzy. Thank you so much for being there. It meant the world to me." "I wouldn't have missed it for anything," she said, her tone turning serious. "I'm sorry about your parents. Their behavior is, well, it's what I've come to expect, which is a tragedy in itself. This was my opening." Actually, I said, taking a deep breath, that's why I'm calling. They sent a card to the hotel. I quickly explained the situation. The condescending note, the check made out to Julian, the hateful memo. I heard her sigh on the other end of the line, a sound of weary frustration. Oh, Grace, I'm so sorry. That is just monstrous. It was, I agreed. But they made a mistake. They used a check from a joint account, an account for grandfather's trues. Your name was on it, Izzy, as a co-signer with my father. The silence on the other end was profound. For a moment I thought the call had dropped. Izzy, are you there? I'm here, she said finally, her voice low and tense. Grace, where are you right now? We're just about to leave the hotel. We were going to head home. Change of plans, she said, her voice now firm and resolute. You're coming to my studio. Don't talk to your parents. Don't talk to Julian. Just get in the car and come straight here. There's something you need to see. An hour later, Alex and I were pulling up to Aunt Isabel's charmingly cluttered cottage and pottery studio on the outskirts of the city. She met us at the door, her face etched with a mixture of anger and determination. She hugged me tightly. Let's go inside, she said. We have a lot to talk about. She led us into her studio, the air thick with the earthy smell of clay and glaze. She cleared a space on a large work table, and I laid out the check fragments. She stared at them, her lips pressed into a thin line. Your grandfather was a very wise man, she began, looking at me. He loved your father, but he wasn't blind to his flaws. He saw Arthur's obsession with wealth and status and how a leaner enabled it. He worried that the money he'd spent his life earning would be used as a weapon, a tool to control and manipulate his grandchildren. He was especially worried about you, Grace. He saw your quiet strength and your integrity, and he feared your father would try to snuff it out. She explained that in the last year of his life, my grandfather, William, had restructured his entire estate. He created a complex trust, and the terms were highly unconventional. He appointed 2 trustees to manage it, my father, Arthur, as his son, and my Aunt Isabel as the person he considered his moral compass. Arthur was furious, Isabel said with a grim smile. He fought it, of course, said his father was senile. But William had all the paperwork in order, psychological evaluations, the works. The trust was ironclad. Your father and I have to mutually approve any non-essential distribution from the trust's main account. That checkbook he used is for the trust's administrative account for paying legal fees and taxes. We are both required signatories. He must have forgotten in his haste to be cruel. So the inheritance my father received, it wasn't just cash? Alex asked, leaning forward. Not at all, Isabel confirmed. The bulk of your grandfather's assets, properties, stocks, investments are all held within the trust. Your father draws a very generous annual stipend from it, enough to fund his and Aliner's lavish lifestyle. But he cannot touch the principal capital without my signature, and I have never given it. A piece of the puzzle clicked into place. My parents' obsession with my financial future, their desperation for me to marry someone successful, it wasn't just about appearances. It was about their own financial reality. They were living off a fixed income, albeit a large one. They had the appearance of vast, independent wealth, but they were, in effect, on an allowance. But why? I asked. What was the purpose of the trust? Isabel walked over to a large, fireproof safe in the corner of her studio. She spun the dial, opened the heavy door, and pulled out a thick leather-bound folder. She placed it on the table in front of me. This is a copy of the trust document, she said. Your grandfather left a copy with me, one with his lawyer and one in a safe deposit box. He knew your father would try to hide it. The purpose of the trust, Grace, is you and Julian. My hands trembled as I opened the folder. The legal language was dense, but Isabel helped me navigate it. The trust was set up to provide for my father for his lifetime, but upon his death, the remaining assets were not to be distributed according to his will. They were to be distributed according to the final clauses of the trust, clauses my grandfather had written himself. Isabel pointed to a specific section. He called it the legacy clause, she said softly. William believed that character was the only true inheritance. The trust was designed to be a final test for his grandchildren. The clause stipulated that the entirety of the trust's assets would be divided equally between his grandchildren, me and Julian, upon a specific condition. The distribution was contingent upon us demonstrating the values he held dear: integrity, independence, and compassion. How this was to be judged was left to the trustees, Isabel and my father. But my grandfather, ever the shrewd planner, had included a fail-safe. If the trustees could not come to a unanimous agreement on the division of the assets based on character, a final, secret addendum would be activated. Your father has spent the last decade trying to mold you and Julian into his idea of success, Isabel said, her eyes flashing with anger. He wants to ensure that when the time comes, he can present a case that Julian, with his high-powered job and wealth, is the worthier heir deserving of the lion's share. He's been trying to prove that your life is a failure, so he can argue you don't meet the terms of the trust. Your choice to marry Alex was, in his mind, the final nail in your coffin. I felt sick. My entire life, every judgment, every criticism, every comparison to my brother, it had all been about this. It was a long, cruel campaign to disinherit me. So what is the addendum? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Isabel gave me a sad, knowing look. Your grandfather was a historian at heart, just like you, Grace. He believed in the power of the written word. He left a letter, sealed and held by his attorney, to be opened only in the event of a trustee dispute. But he also left a clue, a way for his intended heir to find the truth on their own. He told me he added a final page to his personal journals, which he knew would be preserved in the city archives. My own archives, my workplace, a place my father never would have looked. He wanted you to find it, Grace, Isabel said. He set up this entire thing as a test, not just for you, but for your father, a test he knew Arthur would fail. I looked down at the documents, then at Alex, then at my aunt. The path forward was suddenly crystal clear. My grandfather had left me a map, and my parents had just handed me the key. The following Monday felt like the first day of a secret mission. I went to work at the city archives with a newfound energy, the scent of old paper and leather no longer just a comfort, but a call to action. Alex had been incredible, his quiet support a steadying anchor. Your grandfather sounds like a fascinating man, he'd said. He built a puzzle only you could solve. My target was the William Arthur Thornton collection, my grandfather's personal papers, which he had bequeathed to the city upon his death. It was a substantial collection, containing decades of his personal journals, business correspondence, and historical research. My father had sneered at the donation, calling it a vanity project. Now I understood he was probably just relieved to have them out of the house, never suspecting they contained a secret that could unravel his plans. As an archivist, I had full access, but I had to be careful. I didn't want to draw any attention to my search. I started by pulling the finding aid for his collection, the detailed inventory that lists the contents of every box. His journals were organized chronologically, spanning 50 years. I cross-referenced the date of the trust's creation with the journals from his final year. I requisitioned the last 5 journals from the climate-controlled stacks. In the quiet of a private research room, I opened the first one. Reading my grandfather's familiar handwriting felt like having a conversation with him across time. He wrote about his declining health, his frustrations with my father's materialism, and his deep affection for me and Julian. His words painted a picture of a man grappling with his legacy, determined that his life's work would foster character, not just comfort. The entries in the weeks leading up to the trust's finalization were filled with his reasoning. Arthur sees his children as extensions of his own ego, he wrote. Julian is a mirror, reflecting his own ambitions, so he is praised. Grace is a window, showing him a different world he cannot comprehend, so he tries to board it up. I must ensure the window stays open. The words brought tears to my eyes. He had seen me. He had understood. I finally reached the last journal. I turned the pages carefully, my heart pounding. The final entry was dated one day before he passed away. It was short and frail, his handwriting shaky. He wrote about his love for his family and his peace with what was to come. It seemed like a final, gentle goodbye. Disappointment washed over me. Was Isabel mistaken? Had he changed his mind? I leafed through the last few pages again, and my fingers brushed against something. The final page of the journal felt thicker than the rest. I held it up to the light. It was 2 pages, expertly glued together at the edges to appear as one. My hands trembled as I took a paper conservator's micro spatula from my kit. With the precision of a surgeon, I carefully worked the spatula between the pages, breaking the old, brittle seal of the adhesive. The pages separated with a soft whisper, and there it was. A final, hidden page, covered in my grandfather's stronger, more deliberate handwriting from when he had first drafted the trust. It was titled, Addendum to the Legacy Clause, a Final Provision. It was, in essence, a letter to me. My dearest Grace, it began, if you are reading this, it means you have found your way here as I hoped, and the time for secrets is over. I have structured my trust to be a test, and this page is the final answer. He went on to explain his disappointment in my father and his fear that the trust would be used to control me. Therefore, he had created a unique provision that could be activated by a single, specific event. The provision stated that if either of his grandchildren were to marry, and Arthur and Alina Thornton refused to attend the wedding ceremony for reasons of social or financial disapproval, then the power dynamic of the trust would immediately and irrevocably change. Upon receiving proof of such an event, such as a formal written refusal or a notarized statement from a third party who was in attendance, the trusteeship would be restructured. My father, Arthur, would be stripped of his role as trustee. The position would then pass directly to the grandchild whose wedding was boycotted. I had to read the paragraph 3 times to fully absorb its meaning. It was an astonishingly specific, brilliantly targeted clause. My grandfather had anticipated the exact nature of my parents' cruelty. He had predicted that they would use a wedding, the ultimate symbol of family unity, as a moment to exert their control and disapproval. And he had turned their chosen weapon against them. I would replace my father as trustee. I, alongside Aunt Isabel, would be in control of my grandfather's entire estate. The clause was a checkmate he had set up a decade in advance. A cold, righteous fury washed over me, followed by a profound sense of vindication. My parents' final insult, the rejection that was meant to be the capstone of my humiliation, was actually the key to my liberation. Their carefully worded card, their refusal to attend, was the very trigger my grandfather had put in place. They had, in their own elegant handwriting, authored their own downfall. I sat back in my chair, the hidden page held reverently in my hands. The plan began to form in my mind, clear and precise. I needed to act quickly and methodically. First, I made a high-resolution digital scan of the page and a certified copy, authenticated with my official archivist seal. The original I placed in a secure envelope. Next, I needed to gather the rest of my proof. I had the card from my parents. I had the torn check. I also had over 100 witnesses from my wedding who could attest to my parents' absence. My best piece of evidence, however, was Aunt Isabel herself, the other trustee. Her testimony would be irrefutable. I called her during my lunch break. I found it, I said, my voice shaking with adrenaline. I explained the contents of the hidden page. There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end, followed by a low whistle. That magnificent old man, she breathed. He thought of everything. So what's our next move, trustee? Hearing her call me, that sent a shiver of power down my spine. Our next move, I said, my voice hardening with resolve, is a visit to Parker, Steele, and Vance. It's time to read the fine print to my father. We made an appointment with the trust's lawyer for Friday afternoon. I spent the rest of the week preparing a file, compiling every piece of evidence into a neat, undeniable package. The archivist in me took over, creating a narrative of fact that could not be disputed. My parents had spent years trying to write my story for me, casting me as the failure. It was time to present them with a new edition, with a surprise ending written by my grandfather and delivered by me. Friday arrived with the crisp finality of an autumn afternoon. I met Aunt Isabel in the polished marble lobby of the law firm Parker, Steele, and Vance. She squeezed my hand, her expression a mixture of steely resolve and pride. "Ready?" she asked. "More than," I replied. We had arranged the meeting under the pretense of a routine trustee review, a request so bland that my father had agreed to it without suspicion, though he was clearly annoyed at the inconvenience. We were shown into a large, wood-paneled conference room. Mr. Vance, a senior partner in his late 60s with the weary look of a man who had seen every form of human greed, greeted us politely. A moment later, the door opened and my father strode in, followed by my mother. They both stopped short when they saw me. "Grace," my father said, his voice sharp with surprise and displeasure. "What are you doing here? This is a private trustee meeting." "I was invited," I said calmly, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Please sit down, Arthur Aliner," Mr. Vance said, gesturing to the chairs opposite us. "There are some important trust matters to discuss." My parents sat, their posture stiff and wary. My mother refused to look at me, focusing on a point on the far wall. My father, however, stared at me, his eyes narrowed, sensing a trap. "What is this about, Vance?" my father demanded, dispensing with any pleasantries. "Isabel and I have a matter to bring to the board's attention," I said, my voice even and clear. I slid a file across the vast mahogany table. "It cons. RNS a specific provision in my grandfather's trust, the addendum to the legacy clause." My father paled slightly. "I'm not aware of any addendum." "That's because it was hidden," I said, on the final page of his last journal which he bequeathed to the city archives. I watched the blood drain from his face as the implications hit him. He knew exactly what that meant. "This is absurd," he blustered, looking at Mr. Vance. My father was not of sound mind. "On the contrary, Arthur," Mr. Vance interjected, his tone dry. "We have extensive documentation proving William's lucidity. I have reviewed the document Grace discovered, and I can confirm its authenticity. It is a legal and binding component of the trust." I opened my file. "The addendum outlines a very specific scenario," I continued, enjoying the slow, methodical dissection of his world. "It states that if my parents, Arthur and Aliner Thornton, were to refuse to attend my wedding for reasons of social or financial disapproval, my father's role as trustee would be immediately terminated. That role would then be transferred to me, effective immediately." A choked, incredulous laugh escaped my mother. "That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard." "Is it?" I asked, pulling out my next piece of evidence. I slid the wedding card they had sent across the table. "Is this your handwriting, Mother?" She stared at the card, her expression faltering. "It reads, 'We could not be present to witness your regrettable decision. It pains us to see you settle for so much less.' That sounds a great deal like social and financial disapproval to me." "This is a family matter," my father roared, slamming his hand on the table. "It has nothing to do with the trust. Your father seemed to think it had everything to do with the trust." Isabel cut in, her voice cold as ice. "He knew you would use family as a weapon, Arthur. This was his defense against it." I then produced the photograph of the pieced-together check. "And then there is this," I said. "A check for $10,000, written from the trust's administrative account on my wedding day. A wedding present not for me, but for my brother." The memo line reads, "For his future, more suitable wedding. Not only were you absent, you used trust funds to make a statement about my perceived unsuitability." Mr. Vance cleared his throat, looking at my father with undisguised disappointment. "Arthur, the check from the trust account, co-signed by you alone, is a serious breach of your fiduciary duty. That, combined with this addendum, and Isabel's willingness to provide a notarized statement confirming your refusal to attend the wedding, leaves no room for ambiguity." The room was silent for a long moment. My father just stared at me, his face a mask of disbelief and incandescent rage. He had been so utterly, comprehensively outmaneuvered. He had been beaten at his own game of rules and loopholes. My mother was the first to break. "Grace, darling," she said, her voice suddenly syrupy and false. "There has been a terrible misunderstanding. We were upset. A mother is allowed to be emotional. We never meant for it to be taken this way." I looked at her, at this woman who had caused me so much pain, and I felt nothing but a cold, clear pity. "There is no misunderstanding," I said. "You made your choices, you wrote that card, you sent that check, you refused to come to my wedding, and now, as my grandfather intended, you have to live with the consequences." My father stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You will not do this, Grace," he hissed, his voice low and menacing. "I am your father." "You are," I agreed. "And as my father, you will now be receiving your annual stipend based on the approval of myself and Aunt Isabel. The days of you using my grandfather's money to manipulate and control your children are over." I turned to Mr. Vance. Please drop the necessary paperwork to formalize the transfer of trusteeship. Of course, Ms. Thornton, he said, giving me a respectful nod. The use of my formal name in that context was a small but deeply satisfying victory. My father looked as though he had been struck. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time in his life, he had no leverage, no power, no move left to make. He and my mother left the room without another word, their defeat absolute and silent. As the door clicked shut behind them, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Isabel reached across the table and placed her hand on mine. Your grandfather would be so proud, she whispered. I looked at the file in front of me, at the story pieced together from torn paper and hidden ink. My parents had wanted to write me out of the family legacy. Instead, I had just become its guardian. The aftermath was not a storm, but a quiet, chilling silence. My parents didn't call, they didn't text, they didn't send angry emails through their lawyers. Hay simply vanished from my life, retreating into a cocoon of wounded pride. The news, however, traveled. Julian called me a few days later, his voice a mixture of confusion and fury. What did you do, Grace? He demanded. Dad's a wreck. They're saying you've taken control of everything. I didn't take anything, I replied calmly, sitting on the porch of the small house Alex and I now owned. Grandfather's will was executed, that's all. Grandfather's will? He's been gone for 10 years. This was you did this to them, to us. They did this to themselves, Julian, I said, my patience wearing thin. They made a choice to treat me and the man I love with contempt. They just didn't realize there would be a price. Did you know they were using your future wedding as an insult against mine? He was silent for a moment. They were just looking out for the family, he finally mumbled, the words sounding weak and hollow even to him. No, I said, they were looking out for themselves. You should read the trust documents sometime. You might be surprised what grandfather actually wanted for us. He wanted us to be good people, not just rich ones. I left it at that and ended the call. Whether he would ever understand or even try to was his journey, not mine. My first act as trustee, with Isabel's gleeful agreement, was to review my father's stipend. We didn't cut him off, that wasn't my grandfather's intent. But we recalibrated it to the reasonable and comfortable standard the trust deed specified, rather than the excessively lavish one he had set for himself. The country club membership, the frequent European vacations, the constant upgrades to their luxury cars, those would no longer be funded by my grandfather. They would have to live within a budget for the first time in their lives. Our second act was far more important. The trust was vast, holding not just financial assets, but several properties, including a beautiful old farmhouse with several acres of land that my grandfather had always loved. It had sat empty for years because my parents had no interest in its rustic charm. Alex and I visited the property the following weekend. It was neglected but beautiful, with a solid stone structure, huge old trees, and rolling fields. As a landscape designer, Alex saw nothing but potential. He walked the grounds, his eyes alight with ideas, a wildflower meadow here, a vegetable garden there, a restored orchard. It was a place where things could grow. Using a provision in the trust for providing a primary residence for the beneficiaries, Isabel and I approved the transfer of the farmhouse to me and Alex. It was our wedding present, a decade late, from my grandfather. We spent the next year making it our home. The work was hard but joyful. We stripped old wallpaper, sanded floors, and painted walls. Alex transformed the overgrown land into a paradise. My friend Maya designed a beautiful logo for our new endeavor. Thornton Grove, a small, organic farm. We started selling produce at the local farmers market, and Alex began teaching community workshops on sustainable gardening. It was a life built not on status or inheritance, but on shared work, passion, and respect. It was real. We didn't get rich, but we were profoundly happy. One afternoon, about a year after the confrontation, I was sorting through a box of my grandfather's books from the farmhouse attic when a small, sealed envelope fell out. It was addressed to me, in his familiar hand. My hands trembled as I opened it. My dearest Grace, the letter read. I have left you a difficult path, and I am sorry for that, but I knew that of all my family, you had the strength and integrity to walk it. Your father's love for you is real, but his pride is stronger. I hope one day he will see the error of his ways, but I could not risk your future on that hope. This house, this land, this is not just property. It is a foundation. Build a life here not of wealth, but of worth. Love deeply, work honestly, and be happy. That is the only legacy that matters. Tears streamed down my face as I read his words. He had known me, truly known me, and he had given me not just a home, but a blessing. The anger I had held for my parents had faded, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. Their power over me was broken, not because I had taken their money, but because I had finally accepted that their approval was not something I needed to earn. My worth was not up for their debate. It never had been. We built our life at Thornton Grove, piece by piece. It was a quiet life, a good life. We were surrounded by a community of friends, by Alex's warm and loving family, and by the enduring legacy of a wise old man who had planted a seed of truth, knowing that one day, in the right hands, it would finally be allowed to grow.